Welcome to The Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. A common belief in objectivist and libertarian circles is that taxation is theft or robbery. In other words, it's not appropriate. So I was a little surprised when I heard today's guest, who was from the Atlas Society, giving a talk on the subject, and he said that in some instances, taxation is not theft. So I knew right then that I wanted to have a conversation with him about this. He's an assistant research professor of political economy at Duke University and a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. Dr. Richard Salsman, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Michael. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm absolutely pleased to have you here. Okay, so explain, what is your position regarding taxation and whether it's theft or not?
Yeah, the fastest way to put this, so we can delve deeper and where I differ with others. Point one, taxation is the name, and instead of flitting about the name, taxation is the name for government revenues. I don't think most people would object to that, just as in the nomenclature, Second, if, now here's a big if, Michael, if we're not anarchists, there has to be some government. So that's point two. So point one is taxation is revenues for government to support its functions. And two, this is a big one, has to be argued for. We need government. Okay, now step three would be, what is government's proper purpose? I would say to defend individual rights. That's a whole discussion we can have. But then what are its functions? People often confuse the two, purpose and the functions. The purpose is to protect individual rights. Now, the functions are the means by which they carry it out. Mm-hmm. And standardly, this is not just Ayn Rand's objectivism, but Robert Nozick will say this, those who call themselves minarchists, non-monarchists, minarchists, limited government advocates, will usually name three: police, courts, national defense. And again, we can discuss what all those entail because they're way overblown now, but the government does way more than that as well. So now I'm up to, I got taxation as the name of revenues to government. If government is legitimate, it obviously needs resources. And thirdly, but only if it's a proper government. So my conclusion has been that the argument that taxation is theft is somewhat comes out of the rejection of government as legitimate per se. And that's not always the overlap, but the overlap is something like 90%. In other words, the arguments are mostly, since government is illegitimate of any kind, then obviously the thing that funds it is illegitimate of any kind. And I think the last point I would make quickly here is, it's often put this way: since taxation is force, and force is to be banned in human relations, according to the libertarian and in objectivist view, therefore, you see the QED, therefore, this form of force should be banned. But here, the distinction I think is important, and I'll stop after this. It's really not force per se that's banned under either the objectivist or the limited libertarian argument. It's the initiation of force. It's the initiation of force. So even if you didn't have government, if you had a right to self-defense, you're admitting that you have a right to retaliate, maybe even preempt someone trying to harm you, So the use of force in self-defense, certainly to a libertarian, a pro-liberty person, a rights-oriented person, would not be objected to. So again, if that's what government is limited to, we delegate to this agency our right to self-defense. If that's what it's engaging in, not initiating force against us, but acting as that court, police, and military defense, by the way, not offense or nation building abroad.
Sure.
That's basically my order of argument, that taxation is not theft if it's funding legitimate government. And the last step would be, and there are proposals out there even from objectivists, I'm not even for people voluntarily, quote, paying taxes, because suppose that's put up that way and people say, well, I'm just not going to pay. I think that's actually a violation of rights. I think they're the non-payer. They are initiating force against the payers because it's a legitimate government service. And by free riding, in effect, by freeloading, you're engaged in a form of theft. So I flip the whole thing on its head and say non-payers again, in a legitimate government function or context, are the ones who are initiating force.
Okay, I would differ slightly on your definition of taxation. Taxation is
Okay.
government revenue, but I don't think you would
Yeah.
really differ with me. Taxation is compulsory gathering of government revenue.
I would agree with that, Michael.
Okay.
And in
So
fact, I think the phrase voluntary taxation is a kind of like an oxymoron.
sure, it's a contradiction.
But it is used. I mean, I think Ayn Rand used the phrase. So here, I mean, I'm a true blue objectivist. Don't get me wrong, but that doesn't
actually,
mean
this
it
is what she
doesn't mean I
actually.
agree. Did
I
she actually
actually
use?
no,
Yeah.
because she
Oh, okay.
not in this essay, the government financing of a free society. What she
That's the
actually
essay. Yeah.
says
Yeah.
is in a fully free society, taxation, or to be exact, payment for governmental services. So she
Yeah.
differentiates there. She
Yeah.
she was aware that taxation is compulsory. So her idea that taxation is a form of theft, she doesn't use the phraseology, but I think it's
Right.
implicit.
Right.
It's that's an end conclusion, or it's not an end, it's a further down conclusion. So if you start with man's life is the standard of morality, the individual is the proper beneficiary of his or her actions, the initiation of force is evil, and the purpose of government is to protect rights.
Yeah.
So if taxation is compulsory and it's the initiation of force, where do you differ with Rand on that? In other words, where in her chain, starting from man's life as the moral standard to the purpose of government is to protect rights, would you disagree with her?
I think this is a really a later stage, and she even says in the beginning of the essay. By the way, for those who don't know, the essay is a chapter now in the virtue of selfishness. It probably should have gone into capitalism, the unknown ideal, because it's really an issue of government and its role, not strictly an ethical issue. And it was only brief. I think it was 4 or 5 pages. And the way she put it, and here's how I differentiate myself also. She said, this is not the first thing that we would do or worry about in the road back to a free society. In other words, the financing of government. It's something actually in economics I specialize in. I specialize in something called public finance, and public finance is the debates over how government should be funded, what the proper functions of government are. But she does say it's not the first thing, it's like the last thing. And she's thinking if there's a philosophic change sufficient to shrink government down to a size that's very affordable, that there wouldn't be a problem financing it. Today there is a big problem financing it because the chronic deficits, budget deficits and borrowing kind of, as I put it, reflect the fact that it's not supported by taxpayers. The government either is unwilling or unable to make people fully pay for this gargantuan welfare warfare state that they're supporting. But in this context, where would I differ with her on the nature of objectivity and ethics and rights and the role of government? No. It comes right at the end of how to finance it. And I think there's mistakes in this essay. By the way, if you look very closely, actually, my view is actually embedded in some of her precepts. So to me, that essay does not full square come out with the feeling, oh my gosh, she thinks taxation is theft. The very fact that she comes up with suggestions of taxation, one is a lottery, another one is charging fees on legal documents. So it's very interesting. The charging of fees on legal documents. Here she and I are agreeing that the courts are legitimate, but she's recognizing the principle of user pays. So the idea of user pays is a principle in taxation that basically says, well, services rendered, pay for them. But if not, like if you don't have kids in school, you wouldn't be taxed for that because you don't have kids in school. But the other principle, which she and I would definitely disagree with, is this idea that it's based on ability to pay. So the idea of just soak the rich, tax the rich. Why? Not because they're actually using the services or using them more so than others, but because they're rich. So that's another kind of caveat I always add to my point about I'm defending taxation, but it's so far away from the form we have today. Not only is the form today confiscatory in the sense of gargantuan, taking 50% of income, but it's also discriminatory in the sense of certain people pay different tax rates, so they're discriminated against. Others get special tax breaks and subsidies. So the ideal tax system would have none of these loopholes, and and deductions and exemptions that amount to favoritism, nor would we have this graduated rate schedule either.
Okay, so at somewhere near the beginning of that, you said that you and Rand would actually agree when it comes to the need for taxation. And you cited her idea of a lottery or voluntary payments, but that wouldn't be taxation because taxation is compulsory. Where you would agree is that the government needs to be funded, right? But
Yes.
the method is different. Now, you also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that she and you would differ on the idea of that the rich should pay more
Well,
for the government.
I mean disproportionately more as a rate. That's what
Yeah.
the graduated income tax rate is. So,
But she
Michael,
wouldn't be for that. Rand wouldn't be for a graduated income tax.
exactly. No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Because the example that she gave is one of paying for insurance. And she
Yes.
says that people that are wealthier would be using those services more and hence would be paying more than somebody with
Yes.
that was
Yes.
poor. And
Some of
she
what she
says,
said, yeah. Some of
yeah,
what she says does say that. And so for example, if you're a rich person who owns, I don't know, 100 billion of capital stock factories and things like that, you could argue that the Pentagon is protecting you disproportionately more than someone living in an apartment. Yeah, that's true. But notice, even if you had an income tax, and I'm not saying that would be true under a capitalist system, you might be able to do it with sales taxes or other taxes. But even if you had an income tax, the flat rate principle of, say, everyone pays 10% or everyone pays 15%. It's
yeah,
interesting that I believe that would be consistent with justice in the sense that it's not disproportionately applying different rates to people, but it would still mean that the millionaire pays more than the person who
sure.
makes 10,000 a year. But it could be on the argument that the millionaire has more assets deserving of protection and therefore should pay more. But at least there's not a punitive element to it, Michael, which the graduated system has.
Yeah,
It has that. Or even the idea of, sometimes the code will break out not wage income. They'll say that's earned, but then they'll say interest income and capital gains is unearned income. So in the tax code, they actually call it unearned.
yeah.
So that kind of discrimination is improper as well. But yeah, anyway, she here's another way of classifying this, which you might find interesting. She is opposed by the anarchists because she's for government, but she's also kind of in the anarchist camp. She's no anarchist, but in terms of funding, she kind of somewhat adopts what the anarchists would say about funding, namely there should be no compulsory taxation. And then there's that issue of, as you talked about, as I brought up, is that enough? Is that just a redundancy? Compulsory taxation? Yeah, taxation is compulsory, and is it an oxymoron to call it voluntary? And so I wouldn't say she straddled. Ayn Rand very rarely straddled any issue, but this one is somewhat straddled because, of course, she's also against the statists who say government should be unlimited and taxing power should be unlimited. These modern monetary theorists, as you know,
Yeah.
who believe there should be no limits at all on government taxation. So she's a minarchist who also seems to believe, I think inconsistently, that the limited government minarchy can be funded in the way she says. By the way, it would be consistent with her view, and others in objectivism who support her view, if voluntarily, I don't know, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and George Soros funded all of government. I mean, technically, they would be voluntarily gifting the money, right? And suppose in a limited government sense, they could pay for it all. Not sure that's actually true, but once you shrunk government down to what its proper functions are.
Okay.
Now, that kind of thing strikes people as what? Plutocracy. It strikes them as, are you kidding? If
Well,
the government financing was dependent on, a handful of billionaires, that doesn't seem right. Yet it's voluntary.
Well, the fact that
And
it
yet
doesn't
it does.
seem right, though, see, the fact that it
What's
doesn't seem right, it doesn't really matter to me because there's a lot of things that don't seem right to people. The whole idea of ethical
Yeah.
self-interest as moral doesn't seem right to most people, but it
Uh-huh.
nonetheless is. The problem I'm having with the view is this, with the view that you're putting forth is there's no way to escape it that taxation is the initiation of force. whether or not the person against whom force is being initiated ultimately receives some benefit for the money that's taken from him or her, it's still the initiation of force. And to say, well, we're providing you with these services, so you have to pay for them, that kind of, not kind of, it reminds me of the guys in New York with the squeegees that would come clean your window and then demand payment for it. Oh, I didn't ask you to clean my window.
Yeah.
The fact, you chose to do it. So I don't know if the initiation of force is wrong. How do you square the circle and say, well, under some circumstances, it's right?
Because I don't agree that it's the initiation of force. Now, the squeegee example is a good one. That is not a necessary and proper function of government, the squeegee guy. So that is a kind of extortion or intimidation. Here's a service, now pay me. And so that's arbitrary in my regard. And so back to this issue, if we can, and I'm going to presume and stipulate that we can, but I realize it's an entirely different argument, that government is necessary, that these three functions are necessary, it's unavoidable that they must be financed. I don't consider it an initiation of force to make people, and I will say we make people. I mean, they can voluntarily feel patriotic and give money, but really what it comes down to, the brass taxes comes down to, is what about Salsman? What about the non-payers? What about people who will not pay?
Okay.
I am arguing that they should be made to pay, but they should be made to pay because it's improper for them to get a legitimate service for nothing.
But they're not asking for the service.
So
That's the key. Well, in your,
why does that matter?
Well, because in your talk, for instance, you use the objectivist nomenclature. I use it as well. And you talked about looters and moochers.
Right.
Both are ethically improper, but there is a fundamental difference between a looter and a moocher.
Agreed.
In that the looter is initiating force, a moocher isn't. A moocher is getting benefits that are given to him or her by a person, or in this case,
or
government.
they live their lives begging for it.
Yeah, they beg whatever, but they're not using force. And if the purpose of government is to protect rights and to protect people from the initiation of force by others, then to initiate force, even if the argument is made it's for a good purpose, or it's for a proper governmental purpose, it's still initiating force.
But that's not my argument. I would agree with you that if my argument would be improper if I said the following: and the initiation of force is wrong for the reasons stipulated in objectivism, but in this case it's justified. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's not the initiation of force. It's force, but it's almost like if you go into court and you've reneged on a contract and the judge or the jury strikes down a ruling. This happens every day in civil courts. You must pay X. Yes. Now, technically, they're forcing the person to pay X. But why is it legitimate? Because the person has either gotten something for nothing. There is, by the way, in criminal law, there's an actual phrase called theft of services. Now, theft of goods, is like shoplifting. It's pretty easy to think. But government really is providing services, these three things: courts, police, and military. And if you don't pay for those and you've received them, see, here's the key. People who voluntarily choose not to pay under a limited government system are getting the service. They're getting something for nothing. So they are relying on others against their will, by the way. The others who are paying, some of them might feel generous enough to say, I'm paying for you, don't worry about it, buddy. But there are going to be many people who say, why am I paying for this service? It's a legitimate service, but I'm paying more than I would otherwise have to, because, I don't know, half the country just doesn't want to pay. See, in my view, that's not only immoral, it should be deemed illegal to not pay for legitimate government services. And here's the key. If we're talking about a context where you don't get rights protected unless there's government, the person who doesn't pay is basically saying, I want to live in a world where my rights are protected, but I'm not going to provide even a cent. I'm not saying everyone has to pay a lot of money.
Yeah.
How about just $10, right? Like everyone has to pay just on the principle of it. And we could talk about how people pay. See, the argument here to me is not only justice, but to prevent parasitism to prevent what amounts to a smuggled service that someone gets.
There's a few things you said. One was you
Yeah.
gave the analogy of a contract, but a contract is something voluntarily entered into.
Yeah.
So the analogy doesn't fit because this person hasn't voluntarily entered into an agreement to pay. In the case of a contract, if I contract to do something for you, say mow your lawn, and I say I'm going to mow your lawn 10 times, give me $1,000, and then after 5 times, but I say you have to pay me up front. But after 5 times, I say, well, this job was much harder than I thought it was going to be. I'm not going to do it anymore. Now that would be an indirect use of force because I'm keeping your money against an agreement that we made, and your only form of getting your money back would be to use force. But in the case of a person not paying for government services, that person hasn't agreed to pay for them. The person hasn't done anything that, as far as what that's been postulated so far, that would warrant that. And the people that are paying for it are still getting the benefit. They're not losing out. If they're paying for the court system or they're paying for the police or whatever, they're still being protected. And they're doing so voluntarily, knowing that somebody else may be receiving an indirect benefit. So in that case, it's all voluntary. There's been no initiation of force. The initiation comes when you go to that person and say, you must pay for this service. And if you don't, we're going to put you in jail, which is the end result if you, of course, refuse.
I'm not I'm not sure I would go to the point of jailing people, but I guess if you push my view, people absolutely insisted on not paying. That might be an implication. But or just this is a much harder thing to do, but even Ayn Rand thought this could be done. Just exclude them from accessing government services. Well, that's much harder to do. In other words, they go into court, and instead of getting a free lawyer when they're in trouble, they don't get one at all. So that's a technicality. But the first thing you mentioned, I really want to get to, Michael, because it's really so important. This goes way back to representative government theory, this idea of a contract. I've never believed, although I think it's an interesting tradition, I've never believed in what's called the social contract theorizing, which says, we somehow sign or implicitly agree to a social contract to be governed. And even if we're in the minority, we should put up with whatever that governance is. Well, of course, the whole individual rights argument is it doesn't matter whether a majority or group
Right.
violates our rights. It's improper to violate our rights. So it's not the social compact, producing whatever damn government people think they are. So, but on the other hand, I think there is something about the idea of implicit consent, namely, you're born into America, say. Let's get to the point where it's not today's gargantuan violative state, but a legitimate state. You're born into it. You look back and you say, wow, this country was created, say, 250, 300 years ago. I wasn't in the room in Philadelphia when they did this, so I didn't write the contract. But even then, you could argue only 55 men did, not the entire colonies. At some point, I think there's an argument for implicit consent. In other words, that unless you want to leave the territory, unless you do have the right to revolt, if you can get others to agree with you and try to revolt against the government, that at some point you're implicitly agreeing by accepting the services that they're okay with you. And then the difficulty becomes, why are you not paying? And it isn't just an issue. I hope people realize this is not just an issue of, well, I don't have the ability to pay. I'm making $1,000 a year, but I'm making the principal argument that even someone making $1,000 a year should pay, I don't know, $10. You see, now that's nothing. They pay $10 on coffee for a week. It to me, it's actually the principle of everyone should pay something, because these services, by their very nature, are provided to everybody. The Pentagon's not going to say, well, I found some taxpayer in Kansas City who doesn't want to pay, so therefore we're not going to provide national defense to that person in Kansas City. The whole nature of what they call public goods is that they're goods that are provided regardless of whether you pay or not. Now, that has been used to abuse rights by saying to people, well, that means we can compel you to pay for any damn thing we as a government want. That, I think, is improper. But if they're proper functions and services, I do think it's legitimate to make them pay.
You
Yeah.
mentioned implied consent. That goes
Yeah.
back, as far as I know, at least to Locke. Locke mentions
Yes.
implied consent
Yeah.
over and over again.
Yeah.
I see, and I actually would disagree with Rand here. Rand says,
Hmm.
and I think if pushed, she would ultimately agree with me. She said that proper government rests on consent of the governed. I don't think it does, and the reason I don't think it does is this: if you punch me in my face, right, I don't need your consent to respond.
Right.
And I don't think a criminal that lives in a jurisdiction has to consent to being arrested if he's committing crimes. I think he's subject to the government as long as that government is just protecting rights. Whether it's somebody consents to it or not is irrelevant. But at the same time, by that notion that if you're not consenting it, but you're still subject to the sort of
Yes.
penalties or the defenses
Yes.
that are offered,
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know how you can say, well, you've implicitly consented because you lived here, so you have to pay for these services. Because the problem is, well, where would I go? Suppose I'm the guy who says, I'm not consenting to any government. I don't want your national defense. I don't want your police. I don't want any of it, right? Okay. So then the argument goes, well, then you don't have to live here. Okay, where am I going to go? Can I go to Canada? No. Can I go to Mexico? No. Where can I go where they're not going to do the same exact thing? And then everywhere I go, they can say, well, just by being here, you've consented, especially in the case where I've been born here. Like I'm just here. And then, I reach a certain age. I've got to make a living. I have to survive. If I'm not going to be a moocher off production of others, I've got to produce my own stuff. And then you say, well, you lived here, you've produced. It's implicit that the police are going to protect you, even though you've never called them. Give us your stuff.
So everything you've said, I would say, doesn't it, this is a rhetorical question, doesn't it imply, doesn't a rational egoist properly
Mhm.
recognize that he can't live in any of these even semi-civilized spaces without governance? Now, I understand the anarchists wouldn't agree with what I just said there. They would say that peace and harmony are available in non-governmental settings. But I just wanted to say, correct you a bit. She never did say, and this is important because I think she violates her own principle in the financing essay. She never did say that the primary justification of government is consent. She said that's a nice feature of any governance system,
I didn't say
but
that. What I said
that
was
wasn't
proper government. I didn't say
right.
the
But the
proper justification, she said, is
no,
protection of
but
rights.
not. She never. Yes, that's true. Okay, good.
Yeah.
But notice here, yes, she would say, no, the primary purpose of government is to protect individual rights. So let's talk about the features and functions necessary to carry that out. And if someone said to her, well, what about consent? The consent of the governed? That's a big part of the move we made, in the Renaissance and Enlightenment away from monarchies and others to dictatorships and things like that. She would say that is a nice feature of it because it's always better to have consent than not. But the argument was to push against this democratic idea that as long as the majority consents, they can force a minority to do things. That's not really the argument I'm using here. But yeah, she did reject that. Now, the reason I say she's conflicted, I think, in the finance essay, is in the finance essay, she's putting consent first and foremost. I think she is. I think, and improperly. In other words, the whole thing there is got to make sure we find out some way of financing government that's totally consensual. And yet she's talking about government as, what did she define it as? A legal monopoly on the legitimate use of force in a certain territory. By the way, a definition that was from Weber. It's not really her origination of Max Weber. The socialist came up with that famous definition in 1921 or so. It's a legitimate definition, but notice she's talking about use of force. So the anarchist view that government is improper because it uses force at all. Well, of course, her famous distinction was, no, it's only improper if they initiate
Yeah.
force, and this can be a legal agency that, to the extent adopts, as an agent, or we delegate to this agent. I mean, even that idea of delegate, like I hire a lawyer or I hire an investment advisor. I delegate my rights, but this is a pro. I delegate to my car mechanic, go fix my car. But still, you wouldn't do that and not pay them. It would be improper to delegate this to a pro, to pros, and then not pay them. But I'm just coming around to the
No,
earlier
but
point.
Dr. Salzman, in each of those
Yeah.
instances, you're
Yeah.
voluntarily going and purchasing the
Yes.
services of another person. In the
Yes.
case of government, and there's a difference between consenting, you don't have to consent to be subject to the laws of a government. if that government is doing the proper thing, as you say. But there's a big difference between that and consenting to give up my income, where one requires the initiation of force. If you take my money, that's the initiation of force. If you protect others from me violating their rights, which means I'm subject to the laws, there's no
Yeah.
initiation of force. I have to ask you, because I just heard you say something I've never heard before, and I never even occurred to me. Max Weber was a socialist?
No, Matt, no, I cited Max Weber for coming up with that definition of government.
Oh, because you said Max Weber, the socialist. I just wanted to
No,
make sure.
no, the sociologist.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, he was a sociologist. I
And
was thinking,
I hope I
wow.
didn't say. I hope I didn't say socialist. Although some purists would say he was too socialistic, but no,
Probably.
that definition, which has so many key features, like I think we say, what is a state? A state is that institution with a legitimate, easy to use the word legitimate, very interesting, use of force in its particular territories. Even the last part about borders, territory, that's kind of like the nation state. Let me ask you, Mike. I know you're
Sure.
interviewing me, but
Ask
I
me
love
anything
your
you like.
show.
Sure.
I love your show, by the way. For those of
Thank you.
you who don't know, I've been listening to Michael's show. It's really fantastic.
Wow, you
How
have
would you?
George Reisman's book up there.
I
Capitalism.
do. Can you see that? Yeah.
I
Well,
can.
make sure you see mine as well, called "Where Have All the Capitalists Gone?"
Where have all the
A
capitalists gone?
volume that's a volume that came out in 2021. People will like
I
that.
want you to ask me your question. Can you remember? Because I want to tell you a quick story about that book, Capitalism.
Yes, go ahead. I'll remember the question.
Okay. In about 2005, I was
Yeah,
struggling mightily between the Austrian idea of subjective value and the
yes,
objectivist concept of
yeah,
objective value. And
yeah,
because they both seemed so right to me in the context
yeah.
that they were using the terms. And then I came across that book and I heard that he was a student of both Mises and Rand. And I said,
Right.
I've got to have this book. I've got to get it because it can probably
Yeah.
help me. It didn't help me, but in the book, I read that he had the same problem. And I thought, wow, if a guy this smart had this issue, I don't feel so bad. Okay, go ahead and ask your question.
No, but a quick point on that. Years ago, many years ago, it's going on now 30 years ago. I gave 6 lectures on the philosophy of the Austrian School of Economics. It's I think it's out of print, but I'm going to try to bring it back into print. There's just an audio of it at one of the objectivist conferences, and I addressed this issue. And it's interesting because the 3 main Austrians I talked about, Michael, and deep their philosophy, not just their economics, but it was really about their epistemology, their ethics, their role of their view of the role of government. And the 3 main ones I did were Menger, Mises, and Hayek. And now, chronologically, that's how they come. Karl Menger, 1870s, then Mises, turn of the century, and later, and then Hayek, I think, died in 1992. And my theory was Menger was great, and they got progressively worse after that. Now, this is in the context of the Austrians, so they're already pretty good because they're free market guys. But their philosophy, interesting. Menger was an Aristotelian, so he was much closer to Ayn Rand's view, and his view of value was objective. And Mises came along and said, no, you can't. Knowing and recognizing that Menger was the founder of the school, Mises came along and he's a neo-Kantian, kind of admits that in Human Action in the opening pages. And his view is, no, we need to push away from this view because objective to Mises meant the good is inherent in the product.
Yeah,
And
intrinsic.
that sounds like Adam Smith, and that sounds like the labor theory of value. And Menger wasn't really saying that. Menger was saying, listen, the value of a thing is not just in our minds estimating it, that's the subject, but also the constituent features of this good. It can't just be anything. It has to be a good that's of value to us. So it's the relationship between the two. And that's the closest thing to Ayn Rand's view and actually Reisman's view, my view, that value is objective. But Mises took it in the direction of saying, no, we have to stress subjective. And part of it was to push away and say, listen, the businessman is nothing, the consumer is everything. Consumer is king. Do you remember this?
Yes,
Mises
sovereignty of the
was
consumer.
Mises was very shy about defending the capitalist because the Marxists were on his heels, and he would say things like "consumer is king; they determine everything; they determine the value of goods," and so that was a more subjective view, whatever the subject. So anyway, it's interesting that that interested you, because the Austrians to this day will insist that it's a subjective value and the terminology is all messed up. But what Ayn Rand eventually later came to designate these three as the intrinsic view, that's the idea that the value is in the thing apart from your mind. The subjective view, which she also rejected, which is the idea that it's in your head but not in the thing. And objective was the relationship between the two. But there's a lot of mutual support that objectivists and Austrians could give each other, because the Austrians make so many good arguments for free markets. And in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, if you look, the back section of that book with reference, this is 1967 or so, she was recommending in the reading list, Mises, Hazlitt, Bombarvik. I mean, Bombarvik is even in there, one of the great Austrians. There's a mutual support society there. She did not endorse reading Hayek. She thought he was conservative and welfare state. Oh no, here the question I had for you, Mike. How would you classify, I don't know, either morally or legal, the person who refuses to pay, but is in the country and basically kind of, I know we argue about what implicit means, implicitly is saying this is a good country to live in.
I would
How
say,
would you classify them?
I would say he's not behaving rationally.
Hmm.
Certainly, I think that it's rational to pay to have those services. And if he's not behaving rationally, I would say he's behaving unethically, or she's behaving unethically. I think a moocher is ultimately behaving unethically. But I think mooching in a free society would have to be allowed, because the moocher is not initiating force, and if people volunteer to help that person, well, that's on them. And sometimes charity, I think, is justified, and sometimes it goes too far. But so yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. I certainly don't think it'd be a good thing. I don't think it'd be a good person. But if you're going to say that the purpose of the government is to protect rights, and that any initiation of force is a violation of rights, then if the government initiates force against that person, then the government's behaving incorrectly. Now, I'm not opposed to, look, if that person calls the police, and they have some electronic monitor that says, wait a second, this person doesn't fund us, I'm not opposed to letting it go. With there's a bit of an issue there, though, because we don't want criminals running loose, right? So if the guy calls the cops and says, listen, I'm being robbed, it's not just about helping him or her. You got to go get the robber, right?
Agreed. So 2 points. I agree with your first point. Just because there's a moocher or some dishonest person, you can't always legislate morals. I agree with that totally. So I wouldn't classify the non-payer as just a moocher. A moocher in the sense of someone who's just lazy, doesn't work, and then begs and tries to guilt people into giving them money. I wouldn't quite classify the non-payer in the context we're talking about as that. I do classify them as a thief. They're literally not paying for services they're getting and services they're benefiting from. And to me, it's irrelevant, like whether they asked for it or not, because they're living in a country. And if they have any sense of why they are living in a safe and free country, they have to acknowledge it's because of these services. And then to not pay, it's not just someone trying to get something for nothing. It's someone getting something from nothing knowingly and taking it from others, because others have to pay for these things. It's unavoidable that others who pay are basically paying for you. And so you are implicitly stealing from them.
But they're paying voluntarily.
That'll sound extreme. What?
Because the people that are paying voluntarily.
Right, but to the extent there are non-payers, the payers are paying for the non-payers.
Sure. Yeah. But on a voluntary basis, it seems it sounds like you're making an argument for neighborhood effects.
I'm not. By the way, you just said on a voluntary basis. No, I'm saying I'm saying the payers who don't feel the pinch at all, like Elon Musk pays. I still wouldn't call that voluntary. It might be painless because he's wealthier.
Well, if he doesn't have to,
I'm sticking with the view that taxation is compulsory.
I am too.
I am
too. I'm saying that what I'm talking about is in Ayn Rand's ideal society, the free society. If government financing is done on a voluntary basis, then the people that are paying are doing so knowing that there's going to be free riders. They're volunteering to do it. And like I was saying, it sounds like you're making an argument about neighborhood effects. or collateral benefits
It's
that
sometimes called that. Yeah.
somebody happens to be getting. And if you push that argument, again, then I mean, there's all types of benefits and harms that people suffer collaterally, and that's used
Yeah.
to justify all types of bad policy.
Yes. And I'm not in the camp of those economists who say, listen, I found an externality, and therefore government intervenes and either taxes the cost or subsidizes yeah, that doctrine has been totally abused to promote statism. So I'm not going there. The neighborhood effect. Now I'm speaking more of the idea that certain of these services are not only legitimate functions of government because they can be tied back to ways to protect individual rights, but that in a really strong sense, if you think of them, police, courts, and national defense, it's almost impossible to provide those services and exclude people from benefiting from them. Even if you never end up in court, even if you never sue anybody, even if you're never, accosted, people don't realize they do indirectly benefit by just the law and order society generally. And Michael, I wanted to pick up on something you said, because I think this issue is underappreciated in this debate. You were talking about, and I totally agree, the practicality, the impracticality, the actual day-to-day logistical problems associated with excluding people who don't pay. Because Ayn Rand does kind of suggest that, like at one point she says, okay, you could charge fees voluntarily. You could charge fees for going to court, using court time, or if you want certain contracts upheld, you have to pay like a contract fee. And then she would say, but if you don't want to pay, then your contract won't be, the government won't have to endorse the contract. See, now, if you apply that to the police, if you apply that to the military, if you apply that even to the courts, I contend that is chaos, that is unbelievable. There's a neighborhood disturbance. The cops come. They have to figure out who paid or didn't pay. It's it's ridiculous. And so I like the fact that we have this talk on a level of morality, Michael, what's moral, what's improper, initiation of force or not. But I think we also have to be attuned to the practicality of governance. How does it actually work out when someone says, here's my ideal government financing system? Because when you really think about it, it's almost an impractical, not almost, I would say it's a wholly impractical method that she and the voluntary taxation people are advocating.
Well,
and by the way, not because there wouldn't be enough money. One of the problems people make today is if you say to people today, just the general public, should we voluntarily fund government? They would laugh in your face. I mean, the first thing they would say is there wouldn't be enough money. Even under compulsory taxation today, they can't raise enough money.
no,
They would probably, I think in the background, Michael, they know there'd be tax revolts. Not, if they kept inching up the taxation. Okay, so voluntarily, definitely. But then if you ask people why would it not be voluntarily financed? You have to press them to admit that people must not think they're getting what they're paying for, so that they wouldn't pay. Or they might even turn it into egoism, which you and I know, well, it wouldn't be in my self-interest to pay. If I can get away with getting something for nothing, why wouldn't I? So that, notice how they would say, that sounds objectivist. That sounds like an egoistic.
Yeah, it's not though.
An egoistic. Aren't you public spirited? Wouldn't you pay for the services of others? So, but the practical, I think maybe because I study taxes and budgeting and borrowing and things like that, I'm acutely aware of not just the proper functions and purpose of government, but how it's actually carried out. And I think too many objectivists and libertarians, because they have this limited government view, they're not attuned to, well, how do you actually carry it out? What are the branches of government? What are the checks and balances? What are the constitutional limits? How should they be? They call it the political engineering of the system. There's a lot of details in that are missed by these more airy discussions of voluntary taxation or not.
Doesn't that change the discussion though, from one of the proper scope of government is to protect rights, where that's the standard, to a standard of utility?
Well, not utility if it's the main standard, but the idea of it's proper in all fields to know the theoretical and the practical and not have them bifurcated. And I think in this area, and in some areas of political theory on the right, in the libertarian objectivist camp, there's not enough practical knowledge of the day-to-day details of how to actually carry this out. And if there were this greater awareness, then the theoretical presumptions would be better anchored, if that makes any sense. So no, it's not like I'm substituting utility for the rights-based approach. It's that the rights-based approach, it's going to have consequences. We're going to make sure the consequences are understandable. So consequentialism, the idea of what is my ethical standard? One, is it based on human nature? That's the rational egoist approach. But also, what are its practical manifestations? How does this actually work out in reality? Well, here's a good example in government. What about the subpoena power? If I said to someone, there's been a crime, you witnessed it, and they're trying to collect evidence and get the guy, and they're trying to have a court proceeding and gather evidence, and the government goes to you and says, did you see that guy rob the bank? And, yeah. Could you come in and testify in court? And you say, no. So there's something, if you know, called the subpoena power, where the government can compel you to testify. Now that's a good one. And I bring it up because I think it's a bit similar to taxation in the sense of, is this a legitimate government function? The court system? Yeah.
I would say no. I would say no. I would say the subpoena power is not. No, it's not appropriate.
So at least we're consistent here, because I believe in the subpoena power and the power to tax.
Yeah, you're
why would you say
force against me? Because you're compelling me to do something I don't want to do. I haven't violated anybody's rights. I happen to see something, and there's possible dangers, by the way. So, you're going to make me go testify. Now, I might end up dead. They could kill my family. Who knows? I don't know who this is, right?
So they have witness. They do have witness protection.
Yeah, and then you're going to compel me. Here, go into witness protection. So no,
time. This is some people. The time they'll say the time I have to spend in court. Are you subsidizing?
I'm not saying that there's no risks, or if I look at this and I say, well, utopia is the goal. But there's going to be, of course, there's going to be problems. There's going to be problems in any system that we set up. So to me, the question is, what is the most just system? And to me, the most just system is the one in which initiation of force is barred from human relationships.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, go ahead. I'll let you finish that thought, but I want to.
I just wanted to say quickly, the reason I bring up subpoena power is it's within a court system, so it's already one of the functions I said is proper to government, and assume it's a legitimate court proceeding. It's not some kind of antitrust trial or something stupid like that. But to me, it strikes me as specifically, you're a witness to a crime. The rational egoist citizen realizes that not only do these three government functions have to exist and be financed by me, but I realize part of this is data gathering, and part of this is evidence and eyewitness testimony and juries and things like that. And I realize this is how you practically, back to the practicality, this is how you practically implement this particular function. And so it's not a violation of my rights to be told I should go testify as to what I saw. It's no one's violating my rights. I agree there are cases where the government is obligated to make sure you're safe and maybe compensated for the time, or safe from vindictiveness on the part of others. But I think there is a parallel to the taxation argument I gave. That's the only reason I wanted to bring it up, because that's a controversy. I think it's interesting that you found that as well, because you're being consistent on your view. You think both of them are initiation of force.
Sure.
And I think neither of them are, because they're legitimate functions of government.
My last question for you is this. Ayn Rand said that this is the last issue that somebody should advocate for, the taxation. And I mean, personally, I think that, you couldn't have that voluntary government financing right now. I mean, the military costs, the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all the other responsibilities, they've taken on for themselves. Would never, people, like you said, people would revolt even if they had to pay for it with just taxes and not by borrowing.
Yeah.
So how important do you think this issue is in arguing for capitalism?
Very glad you asked this question, because by her standard, you could say, okay, whatever, you admitted it's the last thing, so who cares? Why discuss it? Why debate it? First of all, it brings out the kind of issues we talked about today, which are really important. and it kind of fine tunes them. Namely, what is government doing? What should it be doing? What's the nature and purpose of government? So I find this similarly. Well, someone will say, "Why are you discussing Bitcoin and these other things, or the gold standard? Who cares? The government's just dominating the monetary system anyway." Because it's important to remind people that there are options, that there are these other principles, and it's nice to cross compare and you learn more. But actually, I think the main answer, Michael, is this back to this issue I named of practicality, which is very much underestimated by the liberty movement. The left not only has a theory of what the state should do, if you know, they are constantly coming up with schemes and proposals and reforms and this and that, effectuating their system. That's how they built up the welfare state. That's how they built up the warfare state. And notice that on the right, I'm not accusing everyone on the right of this, to the extent they're conservative, say, or reactionary, they're not really pushing for capitalism. They're not pushing for a better system. They're reacting against, this system coming at them. But even among libertarians, I've had these debates with libertarians. For example, I'll put up a proposal, as I have in some of my books, of how to dismantle the Fed safely and effectively and go back to the gold standard. And I've actually had libertarians say to me, well, wouldn't government have to do something to, wouldn't Congress have to pass some law, or wouldn't have to be some kind of executive order to get this thing going? And I'd say, yes. And they'd say, I'm against it. I'm for laissez-faire and end of story. And so there's the real dearth on our side, on the right. There's a real dearth of proposals and discussions of how to go from today to where we want to be. There's only a discussion of the destination, but not the path to it. So Hayek, spoke of the road to serfdom. Yeah, we know how they did that to us. Where's our road to liberty? Where are our means of dismantling safely, predictably, the welfare state, public school system, the warfare state, central banking? So I think that's why it's important to discuss this, because if you put up a proposal where people can basically say, that's ridiculous, that's never going to happen, no one's going to voluntarily pay for government, end of story, it kind of shuts us out of the debate. So I think philosophically, we're wrong not to be more practical. But I also think strategically, it leaves us out of the debate because the proposals sound so ridiculous. Now, on the anarchist side, they have a bigger problem. When they just say no government, they get dismissed out of hand a lot more easily. But when an objectivist says, no, I'm for limited government, but I want taxation to be totally voluntary, I think they mock them. They open themselves up for mockery as unserious advocates of liberty, because not looking at the practical aspects of it. If that makes sense?
It does, because whenever I'm asked about this, not on my own show, but elsewhere where I'm challenged on it, I always put out the caveat: in principle, taxation is theft. You could not just today abolish it. Much like I think that the public school system is abhorrent, but you couldn't just wake up tomorrow and say, let's end public schooling. You would completely wreck, millions of lives. So I agree that the path is identify the principle, identify the end state, and then, okay, how do we get there? How do we transition to that state? Okay, Dr. Salsman, have I forgotten to ask you anything? Is there anything you think needs to be said on this topic?
Well, that's a good question. There are so many details, Michael, from within, but I think we've covered the broad elements. I think maybe the only thing, but it's more in today's context than anything, but even back to the free society, limited government, people sometimes ask, okay, beyond taxation, would borrowing ever be necessary? Yeah, that's possible. It's possible that for a free limited government, suppose it's in a legitimate war, not an imperialistic war or nation building, but it was existentially threatened. There's an argument for, this is going to be a 2 or 3 year affair. It's going to benefit future generations. So government in some cases should borrow instead of taxing people to the max right away. Borrowing itself is truly voluntary. You don't have to lend to the government, but of course, for them to pay it back, they do have to tax people ultimately. So those are kind of like minor details within. When they go further and say, well, what about government and the monetary system? I've never believed that. It's historically not true that capitalism hasn't provided its own monetary system. I mean, private banks issuing their own currency convertible into gold on the gold standard. So I'm still kind of an old-fashioned guy who still defends the gold standard and free banking, always have, think central banking is awful, think it facilitates the welfare warfare state. We got to this system not because free banking and the gold standard didn't work, but because the gargantuan welfare warfare state can't be financed unless the government monopolizes the money and then issues it without limit. So, but there's many other things on the taxation issue, philosophical. I think you're very good about covering them all. Notice we did a little philosophical, ethical, government role, little economics as well. They're all important parts of this discussion.
And it's a discussion I love to have. So where can people find you? And what about, you were talking about your book about the capitalist and where they've gone?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is richardsalsman.com, SALSMAN. That's where all my stuff is. It's a kind of a hub and spoke system. So if you go there, other places I am. One is at Duke. One is at American Institute for Economic Research. My many essays, public essays are there. The Atlas Society. So I write in 3 or 4 different venues. The 2 more recent books I did, one is long. One's called Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? You'll love it. It's essays on moral political economy. That was 2021. That's produced by AIER.org. But then more recently, if you want something shorter, I don't know if you can see this little pocket guide. This is from the Atlas Society. Pocket Guide to Capitalism. Okay, Michael, look how thin it is.
I do.
That's pretty thin. But I'm really proud of it. It's a succinct summary of all the pillars of capitalism, how to argue for it. So it's not just economics. It's about the politics of it and the ethics of it. And there's even a brief chapter in there on the psychology of it, which most people don't think of. There's certain kind of personality psychology feels more comfortable in a free society than not. And I think we underestimate that as well. We can make all the arguments for limited government and free markets we want, but if people, want to be taken care of, if people are dependent, they're lacking in self-esteem and they want the nanny state, they're going to be demanding social insurance and social safety nets, and you're not going to get capitalism. So that's in there as well. So there's a thing in there also about the sustainability of capitalism. We hear today, that the planet's unsustainable, that capitalism's out of control. I teach a seminar at Duke for freshmen called Capitalism For and Against. And half the readings are trashing capitalism, but half of them defend capitalism. And the rubric I give them is you have to ask for any of these systems, socialism, fascism, capitalism, are they moral? Are they practical? And are they sustainable? So those are like the 3 checkoffs. And I argue that capitalism is sustainable because it's so practical, because it just produces the goods. But further, the reason it's practical is because it's moral. And here's the next step, which most people won't take. It's moral because it's based on rational egoism. So as you know, most economists don't want to talk morality. They don't want to hear that capitalism is moral. Most of them think it's immoral. But even the ones who say, no, there's a moral element to capitalism. And then you ask them, well, what is it? Is it Christian Judeo? Is it subjectivist? No, I'm arguing, no, it's a particular ethic and only that ethic, and it's rational egoism. And that is, as you know, that is a rare, in ethical argument, the case for rational egoism is very much a minority position. But I think it's fundamentally an American one that says you should be able to pursue your happiness. You should be able to be free and pursue your happiness, which means to pursue what's good for you.
Amen to that. All right. Well, thank you for being here. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Till next time.